Hello, everyone. My name is Osman, and I am a postdoc in the Scalable Solvers group. And today I will talk about some recent work on faster algorithms for tensor ring decomposition. So the high-level story here is that there are matrix decompositions, which are used widely across many different computational science fields. And the way a matrix decomposition works is that you have some matrix and you decompose it into two or more components, and then you use these components in some downstream task. A limitation with these methods is that they are limited to arrays with two indices. But there are generalizations, and this is what a tensor decomposition is. So for the purposes of this talk, a tensor is going to be an object with three or more indices, and a tensor decomposition takes a tensor and it decomposes it into a number of smaller tensors. So it's very similar to matrix decomposition. And one reason why you might want to use the tensor decomposition rather than matricizing your data and then applying a matrix decomposition is that a tensor format is more natural for representing a lot of data. And once you have these smaller tensors that you've decomposed your original tensor into, there are, depending on which decomposition you use, there are simple formulas to turn them back into a tensor of the original size. So why should we care about tensor decomposition? I think one good reason is that there are many interesting applications. For example, you can use tensor decomposition for compression, both of data and of models. So for example, say that you have an expensive PDE simulation and it takes up a lot of space on your computer, then you can apply a tensor decomposition technique on this tensor to decompose it into smaller components that you can then store more cheaply than the original tensor. Another application is tensor completion, and this is a case where you observe some of the entries in a tensor, and then you try to recreate what the remaining entries should be. So a lot like matrix completion, but on tensors. A third application, which is sort of a broad category, is data analysis. And the idea here is that you have some data arranged into a tensor, and you apply tensor decomposition to find latent structure in the data that you then use in a downstream analysis task, like perhaps you want to do classification of data. And a fourth application, which is a little bit surprising perhaps, is complexity analysis. So there's a very intimate connection between certain kinds of tensor decomposition and complexity, in particular between, say, the CP tensor decomposition and the problem of finding faster matrix multiplication algorithms. So tensors have lots of different applications, so they're very useful, but they're also difficult to work with. And here I've copied in the title of a paper, which has a little bit of a scary title. It says that most tensor problems are NP hard. And one way to see this difficulty is just thinking about the problem of decomposing a tensor. So we can think about this as an optimization problem. So this tensor here, the white one, is some data, for example, that you want to decompose. And these red, green, and blue boxes here represent the components in some tensor decomposition that you're trying to compute. And we're trying to optimize with respect to all of them at the same time. And we want to minimize this residual that we have here. So this is a non-convex optimization problem, which means it's difficult to solve exactly. And even approximating can be very difficult. So one solution to this problem, in order to find approximate solutions, is to update these components. So instead of solving with all of them, with respect to all of them at the same time, we can update one at a time in an alternating fashion. So this is work that other people have done previously, and it works very well on tensors that are quite small, typically. But then there is a second challenge that comes in when you have tensors that are larger, and especially if they have many modes or many indices. And this is the curse of dimensionality. And this is the challenge that we try to tackle in these papers that I'm talking about today. And we do this by using randomization. So we incorporate techniques from randomized numerical linear algebra to handle this challenge. So what I've talked about so far applies generally to tensor decomposition. And what I want to do now is I want to specify what a tensor ring decomposition is, since that's the kind of decomposition that we're focusing on in these papers. So the way this decomposition works is that you have some data tensor X, and in this case, it has 3 modes or 3 indices, and you decompose it into a number of core tensors. So you have the same number of core tensors as you have indices on the tensor you are decomposing. So if it has 3 indices, you have 3 cores. If you have 5 indices, you have 5 cores, and so on. In all cases, though, each core has 3 modes. So they're like 3-dimensional boxes. And this is made a little bit more precise down here in this mathematical formula. So an element on position I, j, k in X is approximated by this sum here. So A, B, and C are entries in the core tensors A, B, and C. And you can see here that they all have 3 indices. And I've color-coded here to show which indices go together. So A and B have an index in common. B and C have an index in common. And C and A have an index in common. And then we sum over these R1, R2, R3 from 1 up to capital R1, R2, R3. And these numbers up here are known as tensor ring ranks. So when I refer to rank later on, these are the numbers I talk about. So this notation easily gets a little bit messy with all the indices. So another way to represent both tensor rings and other tensor networks is using this tensor network notation. And the way this works is that we use nodes to represent tensors, and then legs represent indices of these tensors. So for example, X here has indices I, J, and K. A, B, and C are all tensors with 3 legs, meaning they have 3 indices each. And when a leg connects 2 nodes, it corresponds to this kind of summation that we have down here. So this is also called a contraction. So just to show how this notation works for something a little bit more familiar, this is how we would write matrix multiplication in this notation. If we're multiplying matrices matrices X and Y, then we would draw it like this. So here, the leg with the index J corresponds to the index that we sum over in this fashion. And the reason it's called a tensor ring is a little bit easier to see when we have tensors with more modes. So here I've copied in a different picture that shows this well. So X here is now a tensor with 5 indices, and it's decomposed into a tensor ring of 5 cores. And you can see here that it's called a ring because it looks like a ring when we draw it in this tensor network notation. So let's first talk about the first challenge. So that was this non-convexity in the optimization problem that we're trying to solve. And I mentioned this earlier, that a possible way to tackle this is to take a slightly less ambitious approach in the optimization problem and optimize with a single core at a time rather than all of them at the same time. So here we optimize with respect to the blue tensor, then with respect to the red, then respect to the green, and then we repeat this over and over again until we get either some desired accuracy or some kind of convergence. And the reason that this is a nice approach to take is that each of these problems actually simplify into something simple, which is a linear least squares problem. So this up here simplifies into this, where X, G, and A are now just matrices. And the way this works is that the tensor X, or the data tensor, is turned into a matrix. And this can be done in different ways, and this is shown here. So if, for example, the columns of the tensor can be turned into rows and organized into a matrix, then A, which is a matrix version of the blue tensor, is created in a similar fashion. So it's just rearranged into a matrix. And then G comes from these two leftover cores that weren't involved in the optimization. And I don't want to say how to compute this, but this is what the formula shows. So the key takeaway here is that there is a formula for computing this. So it's in principle easy to do, but as we'll see on the next slide, it can get expensive. So overall, this alternating approach works well, both for tensor ring decomposition and other decompositions, typically, especially when the tensor we're decomposing is relatively small. But when they're larger, especially when there's many more modes on the tensor, so many more indices, we run into the second challenge, which is that of the cursive dimensionality. And I want to illustrate the form this takes on this particular least squares problem. So here we have the same least squares problem as on the last page. And so, for example, in order to create this least squares problem, we need to form this matrix G, and that was that nasty formula I showed on the last page. And in the case when the tensor has capital N indices, the cost of forming G scales like I to the n minus 1, where n is the number of modes, I is the dimension of each mode. So this is the size of each side of the tensor. And once we've formed G, and we have X and A formed as well, or X is what we're solving for, so we don't need to form it, but we have X and G formed, then the cost of solving this least squares problem itself using a direct method like, say, a QR-based method, it scales like I to the n. So here we have this cursive dimensionality. So in particular, we have this exponential dependence on the number of modes. And this is a problem that we tackle. And the way we do this is by using randomization. In particular, we use random sampling of the rows of this least squares problem. So what we do here is we sample some of the equations, meaning some of the rows of X, some of the rows of G, and then we solve the smaller least squares problem that we get. And by doing this, we both reduce the cost of both forming G and solving the least squares problem itself, but we can also get certain theoretical guarantees on these least square solves. So what I want to do on this slide, there's a lot of stuff going on here, so I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. What I want to do here is just give you some idea of what the improvement looks like and what the contribution is in these two papers. So the contribution is, in a nutshell, that we make algorithms faster and we make them scale better. And this comes at the expense of slightly reduced accuracy. And this is due to the fact that we use randomized algorithms. So first of all, for the tensor ring decomposition, which is the focus of this talk, the standard method, which is that alternating method I showed earlier in its basic form, it has a cost to the leading order, which scales like this. So iter, here's the number of iterations in that alternating algorithm. And then you can see here that we have this I to the n factor. And again, I is the size of each mode, the dimension of each mode, and n is the number of modes. Then in a paper from last year, we improved this using this kind of randomized technique, and we now improve it to something that looks like this. So we still have this exponential dependence on n, unfortunately. However, we now have a factor or number r here instead of I, where r is the rank of the decomposition. So if we're doing something like a low rank decomposition, this is going to be cheaper than the standard method. Then in a follow-up paper, this is further improved to something which now has no exponential dependence on n. So it's all polynomial at this point. I also want to mention something else here. So I want to mention the CP decomposition, which is another very popular tensor decomposition. And similar methods can be used here. So in particular, there's a popular alternating approach for this decomposition as well. And the standard approach there has a leading order cost that looks like this. And once again, we have this I to the n factor in that algorithm. Then there's a paper from 2020 by Brett Larson and Tammy Kolda, and they develop a method which is also a randomized method. And I should add here that we got a lot of inspiration from this paper to develop our own methods for the tensor ring decomposition. So what they do is they also use the sampling-based approach, and they get this cost down to something that's r to the n. So again, an exponential dependence on n, but the rank for the CP decomposition appears here now instead of the I. So it's still much faster when you do a low rank decomposition. Then in this paper here from last year, similar techniques that we use for the tensor ring decomposition can also be applied to the CP decomposition. And when we do that, we also get this improvement where we no longer have an exponential dependence on the number of modes of the tensor. So it's all polynomial at this point. Here, I just want to say a few words about potential applications of tensor decomposition. So this is for a computer vision task where we're trying to classify images. And the data set we're looking at here is the COIL 100 data set. So this is a data set consisting of 100 different objects, like an onion, a car, and so on. They're all photographed from 72 different angles, and the pictures are 128 by 128 pixels, and they're all in color. So the first thing we do here is downsample to 32 by 32, just to make them a little bit smaller. Then we arrange the images into a tensor as shown here. So each of these slices is an image where 3 corresponds to the 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. These are all put together into a big tensor with the 7,200 along one of the modes. So this is number of images. Then we apply a randomized tensor ring decomposition to decompose this in this fashion. So here we do rank 5 on all these edges. And what we have here now is a tensor D, which corresponds to all the images. So one way to think about this is that D now contains features for the images. So while the original images were represented by 32 by 32 by 3, which is over more than 3,000 values, in D, we now have a representation for each image, which only contains 25 values. So what we do at this point is we take D, we reshape it into a matrix. So it has 7,200 rows, 25 columns, and then we use this as an input into a k-nearest neighbor algorithm in MATLAB. And with tenfold cross-validation, we achieve a good accuracy on these images. So the goal here is to classify, I should say as well, the goal is to classify each image into one of the 100 different classes. So to wrap up, there's many interesting tensor decompositions, and they have lots of applications in different areas of science. So they're very useful, but they are challenging to compute. In particular, we had these 2 challenges of challenging optimization problems and the curse of dimensionality. And if we use a combination of alternating minimization and randomization, we can tackle both of these problems. So in this talk, I've discussed how we've developed sampling-based methods for tensor ring decomposition, and we've achieved some nice speed-ups by using these techniques while still retaining a good accuracy decomposition. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions or thoughts, please talk to me after the talk, or feel free to just send me an email. Thank you so much for your attention.